Hello, my friends, and welcome back. Today I want to tell you a story about mercy, about how even in a world ground down to dust, a single human heart can still remember how to offer water. The year was 1800. This was the New Mexico territory, a land scorched by sun and forsaken by rain. The prairie had faded to the pale gray of old bone, cracked and lifeless beneath an unforgiving sky. The wind moved hot and restless through the tall grass, carrying the bitter taste of ash and the weight of prayers long forgotten. Claire Holt had stopped counting the summers since her husband died. Grief no longer marked time for her. Only the groan of the windmill, the fraying rope of the well, and the silence that grew heavier with every passing year. She was 38, still strong from the kind of labor that never truly ends, hauling water, mending fences, holding together whatever the drought had not yet claimed. Each morning she rose before dawn. She lowered the bucket into the cracked well, lifting it slowly, careful not to spill a single drop. The water came up muddy but precious, the last thing on that land that still caught the light like hope. Her father, Amos Holt, spent most days seated on the porch, staring out over fields that no longer answered to prayer. Once he had been a proud soldier, broad-shouldered, loud with talk of duty and God. But the war had ended, the crops had failed, and faith had fallen quiet. He rarely spoke now, and when he did, his words came slow and sharp, like an old hymn remembered wrong. Claire had learned to live with that silence, the kind that asks for no comfort. She had her work, her memories, and the stubborn rhythm of survival. Sometimes when the wind softened, she caught herself humming an old tune one her mother, Eliza Holt, used to sing on long nights. Each time she stopped herself. Out here, even music felt like a waste. The land had turned against them. The cattle were gone. The well was sinking. Even the sky seemed to be holding its breath. Once in her journal, Claire had written, "Some years the land forgets how to be kind, and when that happens, you either harden like stone or you shatter like glass." That morning felt no different. The air was dry. Heat already lifted from the ground. The same ache settled into her back as she leaned into the well handle, hauling the bucket upward, inch by inch, the rope burning her palms. The slosh of water inside sounded almost like music. She poured a little into her canteen, then started the long walk back across the pasture. Dust clung to her dress. The ground cracked beneath her boots. Loneliness settled deep into her bones, the kind that doesn't leave when the sun goes down. Halfway home she stopped. Something lay ahead, a dark shape in the sagebrush, half hidden by the shifting light. At first she thought it was an animal, maybe a steer that hadn't survived the heat. Then it moved. Claire shaded her eyes. It was a man. He lay face down into the dirt. One arm twisted beneath him, the other stretched forward as if he'd been reaching for something that never came. His shirt was torn. His skin burned raw by the sun. Around his wrists, deep, angry marks where chains had bitten into flesh. Her breath caught. She knew the stories. Every settler did. Stories of Apache prisoners escaping army camps to the south. Killers, thieves, men who vanished into the desert after blood was spilled. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. If you see one, don't stop. Don't speak. Don't even pray. Mercy in the wrong direction can hang you just as fast as sin. Claire stood frozen, caught between fear and something else. Something quieter, older. The man's fingers twitched against the dust as if he were still fighting to stay alive. Slowly she knelt. The closer she came, the clearer his suffering became, lips cracked and bleeding, breath shallow but still there. He wasn't just a story, he was human. Broken by the same sun that had scorched her fields, Claire Holt reached for the canteen at her hip and hesitated. One swallow could decide life or death, for him and for her. She loosened the cap. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Can you hear me?" There was no reply. She tipped the canteen to his lips. The man drank like someone pulled back from the edge, desperate, reckless coughing as water spilled down his chin. Then he lifted his head. His eyes opened, dark and unfocused, the deep brown of wet earth after rain. They held each other's gaze for a single heartbeat. That was all it took. Something passed between them. Not words, not understanding, but something older than language itself. Behind her a voice thundered across the field. Claire. She spun around. Her father, Amos Holt, was striding toward her, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his shape cutting through the heat haze. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he shouted. Then he saw the man at her feet and stopped cold. The color drained from his face. "Step away, Claire. He's dying, Pa. Step away." That tone the one soldiers used just before pulling a trigger. "That's an Apache." The word fell between them like a sentence already passed. Claire looked down again. She didn't need to be told what the man was: the copper-burned skin, the black hair, the scars carved by chains and sun. But she saw something else, something her father refused to see. "He's still a man," she said softly. Amos's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're saying. You help him," he continued, "and they'll hang you right beside him." "They'd hang me for giving water," she answered quietly, "and you, for mercy, aimed the wrong way." He spat into the dirt, turned his back, and walked toward the house without another word. Claire stayed where she was. The heat pressed down like judgment. The man groaned faintly, reaching again for the canteen. A memory rose unbidden, her mother, Eliza Holt, years ago on a wagon trail. Lips split and bleeding, whispering for water that never came. Travelers had passed by. "Keep walking," they'd said. "You can't save everyone." Maybe not, Claire thought, but maybe I can save one. She bent down, poured the last drops of water across his lips, and made her choice. From far-off hills, thunder rolled, faint, distant. A promise, or a warning. "Mercy isn't safe," she whispered to herself. "But it's still mercy." And under the dying sun of a merciless land, the story truly began. That night the wind carried the scent of rain, but the clouds were only pretending. It had been too long since the earth remembered how to be kind. Claire stood at her window, watching the horizon bruise with thunder, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Leave him, Claire. You're feeding the devil. He'll come for your soul next." But she couldn't forget the man's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a devil. They were the eyes of someone who had crawled through hell just to keep breathing. Amos Holt went to bed, with his rifle propped beside the door, as he always did. The old boards of the house creaked like warnings. Still Claire lit her lantern, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped into the night. Rain began to fall, not a downpour, but a hard, punishing drizzle, enough to turn dirt into slick mud beneath her boots. The prairie stretched black and endless. Lightning flickered across distant hills. For one brief moment the world looked carved from bone. She found him where she'd left him, half conscious, half gone. The wind had dusted him over again, as if the earth itself had tried to take him back. When she knelt beside him, his lips moved, but no sound came. His skin burned with fever. His breathing was shallow and uneven. "You shouldn't still be alive," she whispered, then softer. "But then again, neither should I. Neither should I." Claire Holt slid her arms beneath his shoulders. He was heavy, far heavier than she expected. Too heavy. Still, she didn't stop. Every step back toward the house felt like a fight. Her dress clung to her legs, soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. By the time she reached the back door, she could hear her father snoring through the wall. Deep, uneven, the kind of sleep born from whiskey and long-held bitterness. Behind the kitchen sat the old root cellar, half buried in the earth. Amos Holt hadn't used it in years. Said there was nothing left worth keeping. Claire pushed the latch open. Cool, damp air rushed up to meet her, dark and earthy. She half dragged, half carried the stranger down the narrow steps, the lantern swinging wildly in her grip. When his body hit the dirt floor, he didn't stir. The cellar smelled of dust and old wood. But it was safe. It was dark. Claire sank down beside him, her arms shaking. For a long moment she did nothing but sit there, breathing hard, listening. Above them, the storm moved across the house. Rain rattled against the roof, a sound that felt like forgiveness, or maybe a warning. "You'll be safe here," she whispered. "Just don't make a sound." He didn't answer. His face was still. Beneath the grime, his skin burned hot. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt the fever pulsing through him, fierce and relentless. The wind moaned through the floorboards. The house itself seemed to shiver. Claire looked at him again, the stranger whose life now rested in her hands. She didn't know his name, his story, or what he'd done to earn the scars carved into his body. But she knew this much. The world had already punished him enough. She dipped a rag into the last of her water and touched it to his lips. He drank weakly, the sound small and desperate. Mercy, she thought. Once given, it couldn't be taken back. For the first time in months, her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from fear. The kind that comes when you finally choose to care again. She blew out the lantern, leaving them both in darkness. Above her, she could hear the steady rhythm of her father's hammer wood, striking wood, fixing fences, mending the few things he could still control. He had no idea what she had hidden beneath his feet. Hours passed. The storm moved on, leaving behind the smell of wet earth. Claire leaned her head against the cellar wall, half asleep, half terrified of what morning would bring. When she woke, gray light filtered down through the cracks in the floorboards. The stranger's eyes were open. They were dark, deep. Watchful, the eyes of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury. For a long time they simply stared at one another. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. "Water," he rasped. Claire nodded, lifting the canteen to his lips again. He drank more slowly this time, watching her over the rim. His gaze never left her. When he finally spoke again, the word came rough, uncertain. Why Claire hesitated. There were 1,000 answers and none. "Because you needed help." He frowned as if the idea didn't make sense. Then he pointed upward, toward the sound of boots creaking on the boards above. "Your father," he said. "He knows." She shook her head. He gave a bitter, breathless laugh. "You bring death here." "No," she said softly. "I brought you life." He looked away, muttering something low in his own language, a sound like wind moving through reeds. She didn't understand the words. But it didn't matter. The sound itself felt sacred, like a prayer carried on air. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Coda." "Coda," she repeated slowly, tasting the name. "I'm Claire." He didn't say her name back, but something flickered across his face, a small sign that she was seen, not as an enemy, but as someone who had dared to reach across the divide, if only for a few stolen days. Claire moved through the house like a wisp, cooking, cleaning, acting as though nothing at all had shifted. With a secret beating beneath the floorboards, she carried food down whenever her father was outside, fixing fence posts. Bread, dried beans, a few strips of meat. Each time Coda thanked her with a quiet dip of his head. His English came haltingly, but his silence said enough. Sometimes she found him awake, his gaze following the seams in the boards overhead, as if listening to a world he was barred from. When she asked whether he needed more food, more rest, more of anything at all, he would only say, "You risk much, Claire." She gave a small shrug, though her hands still shook. "Maybe I'm just tired of being afraid." He studied her, then spoke softly. "My people say hate is the child of hunger. When the belly stays empty too long, the heart eats itself." The plain truth of it struck her harder than any sermon. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance. But down in that cellar, for the first time in years, something small and human began to take root. A fragile mercy humming beneath the house. The days that followed were long and weighty, the kind that pass without pity. Morning arrived with dust and wood smoke. Evening brought the ache of secrets. Below, among the smells of earth and grain, the stranger, Coda, slowly returned to life. Claire brought water at first light, bread at dusk. He spoke little. His English came in shards, uncertain, rough. Her own words felt no steadier, so their language became something else entirely, made of small gestures, quiet looks, and the kind of silence that tells more truth than speech ever could. When she handed him food, he nodded once, never taking more than he needed. When he drank, he cradled the tin with care as though the water itself were sacred. And when she tended his wounds, he turned his eyes away, not from shame, but from respect. Above them, the world went on unchanged, watchful hard. Every few evenings, hoofbeats thundered past the house. Soldiers. Claire would freeze where she stood, needle or spoon suspended in her hand, listening to their voices carry through the dry air. They were hunting an escaped Apache prisoner. Each time her stomach turned to ice, Amos, her father, would stand on the porch watching the riders vanish over the ridge. Trouble's never far, he'd mutter, and Claire, heart pounding, would force a smile. No, Pa, never is. Yet she felt his eyes linger on her more these days, noticing how she stayed near the house instead of the fields. The lies began small. The fence needs fixing. The wash isn't done. I've got bread rising. Each one burned hotter than the last. That night she sat by the cellar door long after he'd gone to bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Coda's breathing below. The secret between them had a pulse now, alive, delicate, dangerous. When she finally went down, she found him sitting upright in the corner, the lantern's faint glow washing his face in gold and shadow. He was carving something with a small knife, his movements slow and careful. She hesitated. "What are you making?" He looked up, startled, then turned the piece of wood toward her. A small bird, wings spread. Rough-hewn, yet somehow alive, ready to lift into the air. "Bird," he said. Then after a pause added softly, "Sparrow." Claire smiled just a little. "It's beautiful." He studied it for another moment. Then he placed it in her palm. "It flies," he said. His voice was low, steady. Even dusty, she turned it over, feeling the warmth left in the wood by his hands. Something tightened in her throat, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps because it was the first gentle thing she'd held in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Coda dipped his head once, then returned to his carving, the soft scrape of the blade filling the quiet. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Claire pressed the small sparrow to her chest. Wind pushed against the house, whispering through the gaps like a restless spirit. She thought of her mother again, how Eliza Holt used to leave little offerings on the windowsill. Shells, dried blossoms, river smooth stones. Beauty doesn't need much, her mother had once said. Just a little light and someone willing to see it. The memory ached. In the days that followed, a delicate rhythm formed between them. At first light, Coda would sit beneath the floorboards, eyes closed, breathing in the thin drafts from above, as if sensing the world through wood and wind. Sometimes he hummed a low, wordless tune that reminded her of running water. When she brought him food, he would say, "Thank you," in his roughened accent, and she would answer softly, "You're welcome." Those two words became a bridge of their own, small, uncertain, but real. One evening, as the sky burned rust red and gold, Amos stepped into the kitchen, hat in hand. "You been near the barn today?" he asked. "Not since morning," she said. Thought I saw tracks." Her heart lurched. "Tracks?" "Boot prints," he muttered. "Bigger than yours." He watched her a long moment. "Maybe I'm seeing ghosts." When he finally left, she collapsed into the chair, trembling. That night she went down to the cellar. In near darkness, lantern turned low. Coda was awake, waiting. "He knows?" he asked quietly. "No," she whispered, "but he's watching." Coda's gaze stayed on hers, calm, understanding. "Danger grows like roots underground," he said. "Then we'll keep it buried," she replied. He tipped his head slightly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You have strong heart." Claire smiled faintly. "It's stubborn, not strong." He shook his head. "Same thing." Outside, wind swept the grass, murmuring through the boards above them. They sat without speaking for a long while, listening to a storm that never came. When she finally rose to go, Coda reached for the small pouch at his neck and loosened a thin cord. He placed a sliver of cedar in her hand, carved with a single curved line, like a feather this time. "For you," he said. "Another bird." He smiled, just barely. "No, for courage." Claire took it, fingers unsteady. "I'll keep it close." And she did. She wore it on a cord beneath her blouse, over her heart. Each time she lied to her father, she touched it for strength. Each time the Union riders thundered past, she felt its shape smooth light, reminding her of the choice she'd made. As the nights grew quieter, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed, less sharp, more sacred. Mercy became her hidden song, humming in her blood. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, in the stillness of the cellar, an outlaw's prayer blended with a widow's heartbeat. Two lonely languages, at last learning how to speak the same truth. The rain finally came after months of dust prayer and quiet disappointment. The sky did not open with mercy, but with rage. Clouds split wide like an old wound, and thunder rolled across the prairie like a verdict being passed. Inside the Holt house, thunder shook the windows. Water streamed down the glass in crooked trails, dragging the bitterness of drought back into the waiting earth. For the first time in a long while, Claire smiled at the sound. It meant the world still knew how to give. Down in the cellar, the air was cool and heavy with damp. Rain seeped through the boards above in a steady rhythm, almost like a song, a promise that maybe, just maybe, something could still take root. Coda sat near the wall, fixing a loose plank with an old hammer. The beat tap, tap. Tap merged with the thunder outside. Above them, the house groaned. Amos had been restless all day, pacing from porch to window, muttering to himself. He never trusted storms. They stirred things in him that calm never could. When Claire came down carrying the lantern, her face glowed soft in the amber light. "You'll catch cold down here," she said. Coda looked up, a faint smile crossing his face. "Cold is honest," he replied. "Heat lies." She gave a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You see the world in strange ways. The only way that kept me alive." They shared a small silence, not an empty one, but the kind that listens. Then, cutting through the roar of rain, came a sound neither of them expected. Boots, slow, measured, heavy. Claire froze the lantern, shaking in her grip. Before she could move, the cellar door creaked open. A hard beam of light spilled down the steps, sharp and blinding. Amos Holt stood in the doorway, lantern held high, his face carved from stone, every line etched with loss. For one breathless moment, no one spoke. Only the storm breathed through the cracks. His eyes moved from Claire to the man beside her. Coda rose to his feet, the hammer still in his hand, his body tightening, not in defiance, but instinct, the way a cornered man meets what's coming. Amos spoke at last, his voice rough and low. "God help me, Claire. You brought one into my home." Her throat went dry as she stepped between them. "Pa, listen," she said, her voice unsteady. "Don't paw me," he snapped. "Do you know what this means? You've lost your damn mind." Lantern light flickered across the wet walls. "He's not your enemy," Claire said, her voice lifting. "He's a man." Amos's jaw tightened. "He's why we bury men like your brother." The words lashed out. For a heartbeat, she didn't see her father. She saw a soldier again, haunted by ghosts he'd never laid to rest. Thunder exploded overhead, rattling dust from the beams. The cellar filled with the scent of wet earth. Coda did not speak. He stood still, dark eyes steady as if he had always known this moment would come. "He's hurt," Claire said now, softer. "He would have died out there. He should have Amos shot back. That's the Lord's work, not yours." Lightning flared, flooding the space between them, and in that harsh light, Claire saw the fear behind her father's fury, the terror of losing her too. He lowered the lantern slowly. His voice cracked. "You'll ruin us both." Then he turned and climbed the stairs. "Pa!" she cried. But he didn't stop. Through the rain, she heard the door slam, the jangle of reins, and then the pounding of hooves, swallowed by the storm. He was riding for the fort. The moment stretched thin. Glass is fragile. Coda let out a slow breath. He goes for them. Claire's heart slammed hard. Her eyes flicked to the open cellar door, rain slanting in like needles. "We have to leave," she whispered. Coda shook his head. "There is nowhere. Every road ends in rope." "Then we take the one they won't follow," she shot back. He held her gaze. The defiance in her face reminded him of fire caught in a windstorm, shaking, but refusing to die. Lightning split the sky again, bleaching the mud-soaked world outside. "He'll bring soldiers before dawn," she said. "If we're still here, we're dead." Coda hesitated. Then he nodded once. "We leave." They gathered what little they could, a blanket, the last of the bread, a few precious drops of water. When Claire reached for the sparrow carving on the shelf, Coda stopped her. "Keep it," he said. "It flies even in dust." The words steadied her hands. The rain came down harder now, soaking her dress as they stepped into the night. Wind clawed at them. The sky burned white with lightning. They crossed the field, mud swallowing their tracks. The storm became their ally, each thunderclap swallowing their steps, each gust scrubbing their trail clean. Behind them the house stood dark against the horizon, the only home she had ever known, and the one she could never return to. At the ridge she turned once. Through sheets of rain she saw the faint glow of her father's lantern moving across the plain. Small, distant, relentless. He would not stop. Claire gripped Coda's arm, her voice barely carried beneath the storm. "He's gone for them. I know," he said. "Then we run." They did into blackness, rain, and the unknown. Thunder rolled behind them like the voice of God himself, warning morning bearing witness. And somewhere beneath that sound, between lightning and wind, Claire felt the truth settle into her bones. The storm was no longer only in the sky. It lived inside her now. Roaring, alive, unstoppable. Mercy had named its price, and she had chosen to pay it. The rain eased to a whisper by the time they reached the dry creek bed. Steam rose from the earth as heat followed the storm, and the air smelled of mud, sage, and fear. Claire's boots sank into the soft ground as she helped Coda down the slope. The creek bed stretched ahead, a narrow wound, cut through the land, deep enough to hide them for a while. The air pressed close, heavy with the silence that always comes before a reckoning. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Above them, the thunder drifted east, taking with it the last of their protection. The wind shifted. It carried something sharper now, the sound of hooves. At first faint, then louder, closer. The sound of pursuit. Claire's breath caught. Coda stopped, head tilting as he listened. "Riders," he said quietly. She turned toward the dark ridge, heart hammering. Through the rain-hazed distance, small lights flickered, lanterns swinging from saddles. The Union riders. They were coming fast, cutting through mud and storm like hounds on a scent. Coda reached for her arm. "Go!" he said. "Hide." She shook her head, gripping his wrist with trembling fingers. "No, not without you." "They come for me," he said. "Not for you. Then they'll have to take us both." Her voice broke, but her eyes did not. Coda looked at her for a long moment. Rain carved dark trails down his face. Coda had known death too many times to count, yet something in this woman's defiance left him unsteady. The hoofbeats swelled closer now. The soldiers were almost on them. Torchlight washed the trees in gold and red like a forest set ablaze. Coda stepped away from her. "No fight," he whispered. "No more running. Don't," she begged. "They'll kill you." "Then I'll be standing," he said quietly. "Not hiding." Claire's tears blended with the rain. "Please, Coda." He turned to her one last time. "You gave me life when the world gave me chains," he said. "Now let me give you peace." The riders broke through the trees, Amos at the front, rifle raised, face washed pale by lightning. 2 soldiers flanked him, their horses churning wet earth. "Stop where you are," one shouted. Coda lifted his hands slowly, palms open. He stood tall against the storm's fading light, proud still, unarmed. "I surrender," he said. "No fight." Amos pulled his horse up short, breathing hard. Eyes flicking from the Apache to his daughter. "Claire, get away from him." She didn't move. She stepped to Coda's side and clutched his arm. "If you take him," she said through the rain, "you take me too." Her father's voice cracked. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." She faced him, dress plastered to her skin, hair clinging to her cheeks. "You told me once mercy could hang me. Then let it. But I won't watch you drag another soul into the ground." The soldiers traded uneasy looks. Rain hissed around them. One muttered, "She's mad." The other spat into the mud. "Or in love." Amos's grip on the rifle wavered. His eyes met hers. And for the first time he didn't see the little girl who followed him through drought and death, but a woman who had found her own kind of faith. Lightning flared, bleaching the world white. In that flash he saw Eliza Holt. Again the same eyes, the same fire. He lowered the rifle. His voice came rough, hollow. "He broke into my cellar," he told the soldiers. "I was bringing him in myself." The girl she didn't know. The younger soldier frowned. "That's not what she's saying." Amos glared at him. "You want paperwork, or you want a prisoner?" The man hesitated, then nodded to his partner. They dismounted, binding Coda's wrists with wet rope. Claire tried to hold on, but Coda eased away gently. "It's all right," he whispered. "No," she said. "It's not. You kept your promise. You gave me life. Now let me keep mine." He met her eyes one last time, and she saw it, the quiet acceptance, the strange peace only those who've suffered too much ever find. They led him to a horse, hands bound back straight. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. Amos turned to his daughter, his voice raw. "Inside, before you ruin us both." But Claire stayed where she was, motionless, as the soldiers rode away, Coda's silhouette thinning into the stormlight rain, smearing him into the horizon. When the last hoofbeat faded, she sank to her knees in the mud, the sparrow carving clenched in her fist. Rain streamed down her face. The world fell quiet again. It was the kind of heartbreak that didn't scream. It hollowed you out until only ache remained. She looked down at the small wooden bird in her palm, its wings slick with rain. "You said it flies even in dust," she whispered. "Then fly now." "Please," she whispered. "Fly to him." Her father stood behind her, silent, the rifle hanging useless in his hand. For once, even he had no words left. The storm had passed, but what it left behind would take a lifetime to repair. Voice low, nearly breaking, the narrator ends. "Some loves are born in silence and die in thunder. But their echo never leaves the land." The rain kept falling steady and unending, washing away the tracks, the blood, the lies. And somewhere in the distance, beneath a sky torn open by lightning, a man rode on, bound but unbroken, carrying with him the sound of her voice and the mercy that had changed them both. Fort Stanton rose like a scar on the horizon walls of sun-bleached timber flags, sagging in the heat. the air thick with iron and sweat. The soldiers, there were weary men, the kind who had forgotten what mercy felt like. By noon, the rain had burned away. The sky turned cruel again, blue, endless, unforgiving. When Claire Holt rode through the gate, her dress still streaked with mud, the guards stared. She did not flinch. "I need to see your commanding officer," she said. The older guard scowled. "This ain't visiting hours, ma'am." "It's not a visit," she replied. "It's a confession." And that was enough to make them listen. Inside the fort smelled of tobacco ink and the weight of order itself. Behind a desk sat Marcus Hale, a man shaped by obedience, his uniform neat, his eyes dull as river stones. He didn't look up when he spoke. "State your business. It's about the Apache you captured last night." His head lifted slowly. "You mean the prisoner awaiting execution?" Claire's heart faltered, but she stood firm. "That man is my husband." The words cracked through the room like a rifle shot. The captain froze, pen suspended mid-stroke. Then he laughed once, not kindly. "Your husband?" "Yes, sir. We were married near Green River, before all this." He leaned back, studying her face. "That's a dangerous lie to tell, miss." "It's not a lie," she said, her voice trembling yet steady. "If being married to him saves his life, then it's the truest thing I've ever spoken." Silence filled the room, heavy, electric. The clerk in the corner stopped writing. A guard shifted. Even the captain's breathing seemed to slow. "You do realize he said that aiding a fugitive is a hanging offense?" "Then hang me," she answered. "But you'll have to hang a wife beside her husband." The captain's jaw tightened. "I don't make the laws, ma'am. I follow them." "Then maybe the law forgot how to be human," she said softly. Before he could answer, the door opened. Amos Holt stepped inside, hat in hand, mud still clinging to his boots, his face gray with guilt and sleepless nights. "Lord help me, girl," he muttered. "What have you done now?" The captain motioned toward him. "You're her kin, her father." "Good. Maybe you can talk some sense into her. She claims the Apache is her husband." Amos's eyes flicked to his daughter, then back to the officer. He swallowed. "She's young," he said quietly. "Doesn't understand the world the way it is." Claire turned to him, her voice breaking. "Pa, please, tell them he's no killer. Tell them what you saw." Amos looked at her, and for a long moment he said nothing. In his silence lived the weight of every choice he'd ever made, the ones that kept him alive and the ones that stole his peace. Finally he spoke. "He broke into my cellar. I was bringing him in myself. But my daughter's not wrong about one thing." He drew a breath. "He never raised a weapon." He could have, Amos Holt said at last, but he didn't. Maybe that counts for something. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. Not enough to set him free. Claire stepped forward, her voice hard now. "Then take me instead. If you're set on a hanging, hang me too. I saved him, and I would do it again." Even Amos flinched at the sound of it. The captain's eyes softened just a shade, like a man hearing a hymn he'd forgotten. He rose, resting his hands on the desk. "You know what you're asking." "I'm asking for justice," she said, "or mercy, whichever still lives here." The captain studied her for a long, long moment. Then he turned to Amos. "You willing to vouch for this marriage?" Amos hesitated. His mouth closed, then opened again. "If I say no, what happens?" "She hangs as an accomplice," the captain replied. "The Apache dies at dawn." The old man stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking. Then he lifted his head, eyes wet and worn. "Then I'll vouch," he said. "The marriage stands. By my word." Claire gasped, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. Marcus Hale nodded slowly. "Very well. The court recognizes the union. The prisoner's life is bound to hers. He'll serve under your supervision, Mr. Holt, as labor, not a free man." The room breathed out. The clerk returned to his papers. The world resumed its turn. The captain turned away, muttering. In a land of dust and judgment, sometimes one word, husband, is enough to change the wind. Outside, the sun burned high over the fort walls, and somewhere in the holding yard, Koda lifted his head, sensing the shift before he knew its name. Spring came early that year. The storms moved on, and the land began to breathe again. Grass returned in pale whispers. The air lost its bite. For the first time in years, the wind carried a hint of life. At the Holt homestead, days settled into a new rhythm. Silence remained, but it no longer bore only grief. It carried change. Koda rose before dawn. He worked with a steadiness that felt almost prayerful, hands scarred and brown, turning soil, mending fences, hauling stone. He wasted no words and no motion. Each strike of the shovel seemed to wake the earth. Amos watched from a distance at first. The porch, the barn, the field's edge. His face stayed guarded, but his eyes tracked every move the Apache made. Claire noticed the difference, how her father no longer muttered when Koda passed, how his jaw didn't set quite so hard. Something in him was easing, though he'd never say it. One morning she found them near the old well, standing shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Amos squinted toward the horizon where a thin trickle seeped from the rocks. "You sure about that vein?" he asked, voice rough. Koda knelt, pressing his palm to the damp earth. "It runs deep," he said, "like truth. You don't always see it, but it's there." Amos said nothing. That evening, Claire saw a clean shirt folded neatly on Koda's cot. No one spoke of it, and Koda didn't thank him. Some understandings didn't need words. The days grew long and full. The three worked side by side beneath the open sky, each learning the other's quiet. At supper, they sat at the same table, Amos at the head, Claire beside him, Koda across. The first time no one spoke for several minutes. Then Amos poured whiskey into 3 cups and lifted his own. "To hard work," he said. His voice came out low, awkward. Claire smiled. "To second chances." Koda lifted his cup, last meeting both their eyes. "To water that does not run dry." The soft clink of tin sounded like a vow. As days slipped into weeks, the land seemed to mend alongside them. Koda's hands drew green shoots from stubborn soil. He patched the barn roof, scrubbed the troughs, and uncovered a spring on the north slope, water bubbling faintly beneath a crust of rock laid down by time. When he called Claire to see it, she knelt by the thin stream, sunlight trembling on the surface. She laughed, the sound breaking open the air like music. "I didn't think this place had any kindness left," she said. Koda smiled faintly. "The earth remembers kindness. It gives back when it's ready." She looked at him, realizing he wasn't only speaking of the soil. That evening, as the sun bled across the hills, Amos joined them by the barn, pipe in hand, leaning against the fence. His eyes were tired but softer than before. "Never thought I'd see this place bloom again," he said. "It just needed someone to listen," Claire answered. Amos studied Koda for a long moment. "You talk to the ground like it hears you." "It does," Koda said. "It hears everything." Amos grunted, half laugh, half doubt. "Maybe so." They stood in quiet, then watching the sky turn red and gold, the new water catching light like glass. That night, after the chores, they shared supper again. Fire popped in the hearth shadows, sliding over the kitchen walls. The air felt lighter, as if the house itself had begun to forgive. Amos poured another round. He didn't look at Koda when he spoke. "You work hard." "Work keeps a man honest," Koda replied. "You think so, I know so." The old man nodded slowly. "Guess that makes 2 of us." Then for a long while the only sounds were rain, ticking in the gutter, and wind, brushing the porch. Claire watched the 2 men, one who had lost everything to hate, and one who had survived because of grace, and felt something shift between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the start of understanding. When the meal ended, Amos stood and went to the door. "You'll want to see the sunrise tomorrow," he said gruffly. "The kind we used to have before the drought." He stepped into the dark, leaving warmth behind. Claire turned to Koda. He stared into the flames, eyes calm. "Do you believe it?" she asked. "What, that the world can change?" He looked at her, his voice soft, sure. The world doesn't change, Claire. People do. And the land follows. She smiled, the fingers tracing the grain of the wooden sparrow she kept near the window. Then maybe this land's learning again. Coda nodded once, firelight flickering in his eyes. Outside, the wind lifted gently, carrying sage and water through the open door. Claire closed her eyes and whispered almost to herself, the world can hate us, if it wants. The land doesn't. For the first time since the drought began, she meant it. The house felt alive again, not because the past was forgotten, but because it was forgiven. The ground beneath them, cracked and scarred, was learning to heal. And so were they. By late summer, peace had grown fragile, too quiet, too good to last. Rumors drifted across the prairie like dust. They said the army was gathering the freed Apache men, taking back those once spared. At first, Amos Holt ignored the talk. But when riders appeared on the far ridge, blue coats flashing in the sun, he knew the storm had found them again. Marcus Hale dismounted by the porch, his face set like carved stone. His voice was thin and dry. Orders from Washington, he said. Every freedman returns to custody, no exceptions. Amos Holt stood on the porch steps, one hand on the rail, the wind tugging at his coat. His daughter stood behind him, Coda beside her. The old man spoke low and steady. You'll have to shoot me first. Hale looked up startled. The years had worn something down in him, but not enough to soften the shock of open defiance. You know I can't do that. Then you can't take him. Either, Amos said. He's worked this land, bled for it, same as me. He's no fugitive. He's family. The silence stretched thin as wire. The other Union riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. Hale rubbed his jaw, eyes tired. At last he let out a long breath. Keep him, he said quietly. But if Washington asks, he's dead. He turned his horse without another word. The others followed their shadows thinning into the pale horizon. When they were gone, the wind returned, soft, forgiving. Amos looked at the pair before him, sunlight painting their faces gold. He nodded once. Then let's make it true in every way that matters. That night they prepared nothing. No lace, no preacher, no witnesses but dawn. The earth itself would be their church. When morning came, the sky was clear and kind. The air smelled of wet sage and new grass. The well rope creaked softly, lifting a bucket of the cleanest water the land had known in years. Amos stood beside it with his Bible and trembling hands. His eyes, once hard as flint, had gone gentle. Claire wore her mother's faded blue dress. Coda stood with her, a carved sparrow, tied to his wrist with a piece of string. Amos's voice shook, but his words carried. By the laws of this land and the grace of the Almighty, he said, I declare you, husband and wife. May you always find water when the world runs dry. Claire took Coda's hands, his grip strong, warm, a promise in itself. For a moment no one spoke. The wind stirred alive, brushing tall grass, carrying the faint sound of a wooden flute. It was Coda's melody. The same song he once hummed in a dark cellar, now lifted to open sky. The wind that once carried fear now whispered peace. Amos gazed over the hills and said softly, Looks like the land chose right after all. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in gold, the three of them stood together, no longer bound by fear or law, but by something stronger, something the earth itself seemed to understand. Mercy is not weakness. It's the sound the soul makes when it remembers what it's for. And if this story touched your heart tonight, my friends, tell me where you're listening from in the comments below. I'd love to know what this tale meant to you and which part stayed with your soul the longest. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another story where the wind still carries the voices of the Old West and every act of mercy still echoes across the land. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts, as creative assistants. However, All content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.